820th contact. Thursday, September 8, 2022, 8:57 HRS. Billy. Ta, greetings and welcome my friend. Ta. It is unpleasant what has happened, but greetings also, Edward. What exactly happened? Of course, we cleared that up immediately, and what transpired? Billy. That's why I also called Florina and hoped that she would get to the bottom of it. It was now the 25th time that an attempt was made to send me to the afterlife, this time in the presence of two people, namely Marianne and Willem. We had already been sitting in front of the house for 45 minutes talking, when suddenly at 14:25 HRS a shot was fired above the house bunker, whereupon of course the numerous birds that were at the feeding places disappeared in a flash and only returned to their feeding places after more than an hour. I quickly ran up the bunkered stairs and wanted to open the gate to the footpath because I heard someone running away and wanted to confront him. But the gate was locked because a Schloiling had screwed the lock shut, consequently all I could see was a man running away, carrying on his right shoulder a small trestle ladder about 1 meter tall, but with a Flobert rifle in his left hand. Apparently, he was using the small trestle ladder to be able to see over the high cover of the privacy screen that prevents you from looking down on the entrance to the house. Of course, I quickly realized that another attempt had been made to blow out my lifelight, which is why Willem and I then looked for a bullet hole, but could not find anything. Presumably the bullet chirped off because it was probably deflected by the branches and leaves of the screen and whizzed somewhere other than down to us, where it could have hit me, Willem or Marianne. Ta. Fortunately, that was not the case, as we were able to determine by looking back. The projectile could not have been deflected by the branches and leaves, because when the shot was released, it traveled skywards and not through the thicket of the side obstruction. Obviously the man was trying to get a position and a view down to the house with a short two-part self-standing ladder so that he could shoot at you, which would also have endangered Willem and Marianne, because they were in the line of fire from the view of the shooter, who moreover was not alone. He was with another man who, however, was keeping watch above the stairs, to the pulpit, as you call it. The gunner, however, who climbed the short ladder and wanted to shoot at you, slipped on it and therefore waved the rifle violently back and forth in the air, releasing the shot and driving away high up. Then the man fell to the ground, quickly picked himself up again, took the small ladder as well as the rifle and ran away to quickly climb up at the end of the pulpit garden and run away over the pulpit together with the other man. Both of them squeezed through the bushes at the upper end of the pulpit, ran away over the back pulpit and disappeared into the forest. However, we do not know where the two fled to. Billy. So we looked in vain for an impact. We did not consider that the shot went into the sky, because searching at that altitude would have been pointless anyway. Then everything happily turned out another time so that nothing else happened. Ta. It should also stay that way, which is why you should be careful either way. The hatred against you, which has been running through your whole life since your youth and has caused attacks against you because you proclaim the truth concerning the religious beliefs of Earth humans, will never end, and that too when you will no longer be. Billy. I am, cautiously I mean, but despite all caution something can happen, you never know. Also the warning feeling this time was only faint and so not strong, perhaps precisely because the shot went to the sky. Ta. That may be. In any case, caution is advised for you, also for those who are around you, because even if, as far as we know, these persons are not to be attacked, but you, there is a danger that they will be unintentionally affected. Billy. That can indeed be possible, but then unintentionally, as you say. In any case, everything has gone well so far, so even the others who have been directly involved in such attacks have not suffered any damage, so there is nothing more to talk about. I am also not upset because of this that people are trying to get rid of me. Rather, tell me what Quetzal said about the trees we should plant in relation to climate change, which is increasingly making itself felt and claiming human lives. For my part, I am thinking of the French maple tree, among others, as well as field maple of the Elsrich variety. But according to Quetzal's advice, which trees need the least water? Ta. With little need for water, he names the following trees, which he suggests for your advice, as I have them on the list here. It says to name the stone pines, Pinus sembra, rest Swiss stone pines. In addition, this list also includes the following worth mentioning. Hornbeam, Carpinus betulus. Sycamore maple, Acer pseudoplatanus. Weeping birch, Betula pendula. Sour cherry, Prunus cerasus. Field maple, Acer campestre. Larch, Larix. Walnut, Juglans regia, etc. He names the following climate trees that cope well with extreme heat and drought. Lampion tree, Coelruteria paniculata. Trumpet tree, Catalpa bignonioides. Hackberry tree, Celtis australis, etc. For the future, he names the following guest plants for your forest. Note Billy, guest plants equals non-native, invasive resp introduced, brought in, or naturally immigrated. Red oak, Quercus rubra. Grand fir, Abies grandis. Japanese larch, Larix comfrey, and hybrid larch, cross between European larch, Larix decidua, and Japanese larch, Larix comfrey. Black locust, Robinia pseudoacacia, etc. Invasive plant species mean an enrichment of nature, thus many plants of the traditional invasive genera and species, contrary assessments of wrong-thinking Earth humans by wrongly oriented anti-invasive interest groups, have according to our millennia of experience always brought an enrichment of the respective nature, depending on the plant species, and thus a full justification of invasiveness. An expansion of the cultivation of invasive plants of all genera and species does not require a careful consideration of all advantages and disadvantages, because these are given by nature, both for so-called native plant genera and plant species adapted to the area from the ground up, and also for plant genera and plant species of invasive forms. However, attention is to be paid to genera and species that are basically upwelling resp swelling and thus proliferating, that are behaving resp suppressing towards other plants, and that behave aggressively towards other plant species in nature. However, these are very, very few, and especially not the majority of those that are denigrated before earthly anti-invasive fanatics and corresponding interest groups, i.e. classified and denigrated as species displacing, suppressing the native plant world and is rampant. According to our detailed research, in percentage terms very few of the previously introduced, unintentionally introduced and naturally immigrated plant species are proliferating and displacing native genera and species. These effectively very few genera and species, from mosses to trees, affect such a small number that these plants can easily be countered by vigilance through targeted eradication and damage to native flora can be avoided. Billy. This was explained to me by your father Svath, because even as a boy I was very interested in nature and its fauna and flora, which prompted him and also my teachers to encourage me in natural history. So I learned a lot about the guest plant genera and guest plant species, and of course also about the fact that even back then there were delusional people naturalists who wanted to demonize and eradicate everything that concerned invasive plants of all genera and species because they were non-native. But I learned that every genus and species of invasive plants can never be harmful to native genera and species if they are able to grow and thrive in the wild without harm, i.e. not rampantly. In addition, I learned that invasive and alien plants of all genera and species naturally move away from their traditional habitats over the course of thousands of years and decades and gain a foothold elsewhere on the planet, thus conquering new habitats. Invasive and also native plant genera and species also change in their way of life with regard to their nutrition, movement and health, etc. This also occurs in humans. This also occurs with human beings, animals, creatures and all other genera and species of life forms, which adapt to the respective new living conditions of the constantly changing environment. And this is also happening in a blatant way at present through the atmosphere and climate change, through the effects of which all life forms on the whole Earth are transforming and changing in some way or other, which, however, has not yet been recognized by the clever scientists, but will only be recognized and established once they start thinking about how in reality and truth the life of nature really works. This will also lead to the delusion sufferers being taught better with regard to all the invasive genera and species of plants, animals, creatures and all other life forms they are fighting against, insofar as they become wiser, and thus more understanding and reasonable. Fighting the invasives of nature and its fauna and flora is not natural and should not be fought, because everything changes naturally over time and so also plant genera and plant species, as well as genera and species of animals and other living beings, including human beings, adapt to new living conditions and thus change. Sometimes it takes hundreds or thousands or even millions of years for this to happen, which should actually be known and taught to the ignorant people, especially by those of the clever scientists who deal with the matter of the eternal change and renewal of all life forms as well as the atmosphere and the climate as well as the stars, the planets and the universe. You are asking too much, for the vast majority of Earth humans, especially those who use titles of their profession, are narrow-minded and of the false opinion that they are luminaries, that is, that they have extraordinary abilities in their field of knowledge. Many of their imagined abilities in this respect are as a rule really incomplete and very deficient and are based only on assumptions and thus on presumptions which are often revised only after years, decades or centuries. Billy. I know that and have seen it many times during my life in world events, witnessed it and experienced it with foreknowledge that everything will turn out much differently than Earthlings imagine. The blatant overpopulation alone will bring such a huge change that no one of the entire Earth's population can imagine. And as for climate change, which will bring many guest plants and guest animals, guest creatures and guest life forms of other genera and species, the delusional who oppose the invasive can never, ever imagine that. The climate change that is taking place raises the need for new invasive plant genera and species to be deliberately cultivated now, because the expected changes that are already occurring and to which invasive genera and species have already been adapting for some time and have recently been adapting more and more, give rise to the thought that it should now be done deliberately as a matter of urgency. Due to the still false predictions of delusional fanatics who demonize invasive plants, one must warn. Site-appropriate mixed stands oriented to the present and to the presumed future natural forest community offer a low-risk starting position. The preservation of spruce in particular requires attention today, because it is a tree that already requires considerable effort in various locations to allow it to continue to thrive. Climate change is already causing major problems for this tree, e.g. with the increase in summer drought, which is becoming increasingly severe. Therefore, if the cultivation of invasive trees is considered, the suitability of the respective genus or species and also its origin must be taken into account. What is also required is a careful balancing of objectives between potential uses, side effects as well as conservation objectives, such as an assessment of the invasion potential, by which I mean that undesirable vegetation changes may occur. And what is to be said regarding invasive trees, that relates to the following, especially silvicultural concepts based on site-appropriate tree species selection would be a necessity to be discussed, because an adequate participation of invasive tree stands that are as good as possible would meet economic demands and nature conservation goals in equal measure. The most important tree species would have to be listed, and in addition, there are already cultivations of coast and noble firs, Abies grandis, Procera, trees of life, Thuja plicata, hemlocks, Tsuga spec, black walnut trees, Juglans nigra, as well as balsam poplars and poplar hybrids, Populus spec, on a small scale in Europe. The tree genus or species must, however, be adapted to the soil and to the present and future climate and should be given the location that is necessary for it to grow and thrive, just as any other plant requires. If this does not happen, or if there are other plants that repel the foreigners, then competition arises. An economic role is currently played by the invasive trees Douglas fir and strobe, which, after more than 100 years of introduction, allow us to realistically assess the cultivation and the possibilities and risks of Douglas fir. The tree Douglas fir regenerates generatively in the forest via seeds, but the regeneration of the tree allows the competition between the other growth and different tree species to be well controlled by silvicultural means. The concerns of the delusionists about invasiveness and conservation with regard to impacts on native trees and other flora, animals, fauna and other creatures are unobjectionable, and furthermore, they inevitably change and consequently adapt. It is a fact that the Douglas fir is already involved to a certain extent in the stocking of the tree population in Europe. Furthermore, foreign tree species are also already found in urban areas, in parks, gardens and in tree plantations along traffic routes, etc. Fast-growing tree species, for example, already occupy a special position, with tree cultivation for biomass production, for energy generation coming to the fore, especially for heating purposes. One can even speak of energy forests in this respect, whereby mostly balsam poplars and poplar hybrids are cultivated for this purpose. Targets and values of invasive trees are still to be defined at this time, namely whether an invasive tree species can perhaps cause damage and become aggressive to native plant communities, or whether ecosystems can still be threatened. But the dispersal efficiency of a genus or species that establishes itself in an area as a result of human mediation fundamentally determines whether or not the genus or species can reproduce and spread further. This usually involves the birds and the wind, as these are responsible for transporting many seeds over long distances, as in the case of the red oak by the jay, for example. Whether a genus or species of tree or other plant has a damaging effect on native trees or other plants, or even gets out of control, depends in particular on the competitive strength and growth of the corresponding individuals, but also on whether the native trees or other plants succeed in gaining dominance over the invasive plants. This, however, is not the order of the day, because normally nature regulates the whole thing in such a way that everything proceeds peacefully and adaptively. If, in rare cases, this is not the case, then the same thing happens as with other living things. To this end, the same procedure is found as with human beings, animals, creatures and other living beings, for they all want or have to assert themselves against others who intrude into their sphere of life. Either they win or they fail, so it happens that if they assert themselves, then they assimilate, but if they fail, then they draw the finish line and allow themselves to be displaced. In many cases, to the detriment of invasive neophytes and native plant genera and species, the importance of site conditions and ecosystem conditions is underestimated. For example, herbaceous neophytes often appear in forests at certain sites that are unsuitable for certain tree genera or tree species. Native plant communities are seldom disturbed, but in order to control individual genera and species, it is necessary to consider what is important when site alterations take place. New plant invasions imply the need for integrating careful clarification of the interrelationships between the characteristics of a plant genus or species and the ecosystem concerned. This is especially true for trees, such as late-flowering weeping cherry or black locust, in which case it must be understood that these trees have pioneer characteristics, as they produce seeds at a young age that are dispersed by animals. Their seeds remain viable in the soil for several years, thus building up a permanent seed bank, while these trees also produce cane shoots and root fry. The young plants, however, need a lot of light if they are to grow and flourish. Interestingly, as I recall Svatha's teaching, vegetative propagation comes to the fore in plants under unfavorable living conditions, for example, at the borders of their natural growing area, as well as when colonizing border areas. This enables the plants to spread and remain in the respective location. Various plants react to cutting and injury with replacement shoot formation and increased clonal growth. If, for example, the robinia tree is taken, it has a symbiosis with rhizobium bacteria and also the ability to bind atmospheric nitrogen. This enables the tree to grow rapidly even on a poor substrate, but this leads to undesirable vegetation changes in the substrate. But all these explanations lead into the infinite, which is why I'd better not go on and ask you openly how you actually feel about alcohol, drugs, and poisons. We have all kinds of difficulties with these on Earth. We do not have anything to do with these substances, consequently we do not know such problems as they prevail on Earth. Billy. Then something else, with SFAF, far from Earth, I was able to observe once when a gamma ray burst occurred very far away in the material belt. SFAF explained to me that something similar to the creation of the universe from the nihilo, the absolute nothing, was happening. Here, however, it was the case that matter accumulated to form an enormously powerful energy complex that swallowed up countless suns and planets, etc., and thus became ever more energetic and gigantic. The whole thing becomes a giant structure that stores more and more energy in itself, precisely by swallowing suns and planets, etc., until it is so overloaded that it explodes, which then produces a gamma flash. This lightning, however, was in its form nothing other than newly forming matter, from which new celestial bodies, rest suns, and also planets, etc., were created in the course of billions of years. These giant formations, he said at the time, would in future be called black holes if they were discovered by stargazers. This corresponds to what our peoples have known for millions of years, and my father explained to you because you had much knowledge and responsibility to learn and understand. And while I am at it, mentioning the responsibility and knowledge, I will mention the precious few of our people who have asked me to tell you what they have asked me to tell you. If I want to say everything in brief, then everything is to be put into the following words: politicians should not hold office for more than 1 year, after which they would have to leave and be replaced by others. This alone would prevent such criminal decisions from being taken and enforced, as has happened in Switzerland by the leaders in the form of the thoughtless and irresponsible infliction of damage with regard to neutrality. This could happen because incompetent persons are in charge of the state, who have had no education whatsoever regarding the conduct of the state and the effectiveness of neutrality, and thus do not know that it does not involve any deviations. Also, the pretense that neutrality allows and justifies peaceful military cooperation and maneuvers with a foreign military power, as in the case of NATO, corresponds not only to a misunderstanding and ignorance of neutrality, but also to an unparalleled delusion of wanting power and irresponsibility. For my part, I have to mention that the majority of Swiss leaders obviously do not learn anything from their mistakes and do not try to correct the mistakes, so they do not correct the damage done by doing better, but continue to do the same damage. This would not be possible with us, as it probably is in other countries where righteousness prevails. The fact that in your home country, Switzerland, of all places, irresponsible things can happen through the dishonest and also criminal machinations of certain state leaders and are still falsely and stupidly justified, that is no longer understandable. Billy. What is one to do when incompetents, self-seekers and megalomaniacs wield the scepter in government who are truly no good and brazenly destroy the welfare of the country? Unfortunately, the serious violation of Switzerland's neutrality is not only the fault of one incompetent government official, but of all the incompetent elements in the Federal Council, the National Council and the Council of States. However, these morons and cows pretending to be Swiss are in fact stupid, idiotic and evil traitors to the country who should not be in their positions, but belong behind bars or in the madhouse. You recognize their behavior correctly, but that too will be one more reason for you to be hated, so it will not just remain with the members of the sectarian religious faithful who hate you and seek your life. Billy. I am aware of that, but it does not bother me because I do not have my view to hide. What still interests me now, however, is the corona epidemic. It is currently on the decline, but it is still going on and it is still claiming victims. But what about the fact that you don't hear much from China because everything is just kept quiet there? It is useless to talk about that, because everything is really being kept quiet, even though there are a lot of victims. Billy. So, as usual, also regarding the yellow peril, which has to be considered again because the fallible ones of the USA are dangerously taunting and want to provoke something with Taiwan, as they are doing in Ukraine together with their lackey Zelensky, who is listened to by the stupid ones of different governments and partly also populations of other countries, who supply heavy weapons to him, which he uses through his army, supporting the plans of the hegemony of the USA. He is as dumb and stupid as his supporters, all of whom do not think and cannot comprehend what America and its shadow government actually intend and do. What is unfortunate is for those human beings in the USA who are of a different mind, who are righteous and who do not agree with America's secret warlike machinations and the huge amounts of money it spends on arms deliveries to Ukraine, as a result of which the state of the USA is running up its horrendous debts more and more. Debts that have to be paid off again, for whichever more horrendous taxes have to be paid, and this of all things by taxpayers who want nothing to do with what America, in its delusion of hegemony, is doling out vast amounts of dollars for weapons to the USA lackey and war criminal in Ukraine, who is prolonging the war through his delusion. Because of the Yellow Peril, as it was often called in the past when talking about China, everything has changed since Mao is dead. He was a murderer beyond compare, which is why he gladly went along with the plan of, when he revealed to him his plan to wipe out America's population with a laboratory-created plague. In addition, I remember very clearly Mao's atrocity orders, the effects of which I was able to see together with Ascot when he ordered the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. More than 40 million human beings fell victim to the revolution at that time, countless of whom were eaten by their murderers. Mao himself ordered that the corpses were not simply buried, but cannibalized and their flesh cooked and eaten by the human beings to counteract the famine that arose at the time of the revolution and counter-revolution. Mass executions took place simply because a human being uttered an evil word against Mao. Friends betrayed friends, children betrayed their parents and parents betrayed their children, and those who were betrayed were shot on sight or beaten to death, cannibalized, boiled and eaten. Together with Ascot, I saw mass executions and atrocities that I will never forget. Unfortunately, that is how it was back then. I only know everything from Ascot's stories, but that is how I know it must have been horrific. Billy. Yes, you can put it that way. But now I do not want to talk about it anymore, because now something is coming up that just happened. There were still the IAEA inspectors at the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia in Ukraine, but what is actually to be thought of these inspectors? All these persons are unfortunately influenced by anti-propaganda against Russia, so they did not take a neutral position in terms of opinion. However, this had no influence regarding their control work. Billy. It could not be otherwise. I am thinking of the influence of the widespread hatred against Russia, which probably does not stop anywhere. But something else again, with SFAF I once saw a monster wave in the Pacific, they sweep giant freighters into the depths of the seas when they simply roll over them. The giant thing was 38 meters high, as your father said. So I have been wanting to ask for a long time whether there are also such water monsters on the seas here on Era? That is so. Billy. SFAF explained that planetary internal Earth movements would create such monster waves. That corresponds to the fact, because internal Earth movements create such monster waves, with magma creating internal displacements that vibrate and spread to the waters of the seas, causing them to churn. Billy. SFAF also explained it that way, among other things. But what is the meaning of my waiting in vain so far to receive the drawings of the likenesses, namely of Jeremiah, Elijah and Muhammad? Bermunda will look into it. She is not art-educated in that way, but she will certainly make an effort when she comes back to visit you. Billy. Then she is presently gone? Yes, on Era, where she has a task to attend to, which will take some time. Billy. I will wait then. Good, but now I must return, for I am called. Billy. Too bad, because I had something I wanted to talk to you about. On my next visit. Until then, goodbye, Edouard, my friend. Billy. Goodbye, goodbye, dear friend.